Philosophical Trends in the Feminist Movement by Anuradha Ghandy. Overview of women's movement in the West. The women's movement in the West is divided into two phases. The first phase arose in the mid-19th century and ended by the 1920s, while the second phase began in the 1960s. The first phase is known for the suffragette movement, or the movement of women for their political rights, that is, the right to vote. The women's movement arose in context of the growth of capitalism and the spread of a democratic ideology. It arose in the context of other social movements that emerged at the time. In the U.S., the movement to free the black slaves and the movement to organize the ever-increasing ranks of the proletariat were an important part of the socio-political ferment of the 19th century. In the 1830s and 40s, the abolitionists, those campaigning for the abolition of slavery, included some educated women who braved social opposition to campaign to free the Negroes from slavery. Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan Anthony, Angeline Grimke were among the women active in the anti-slavery movement who later became active in the struggle for women's political rights. But opposition within the anti-slavery organizations to women representing them and to women in leadership forced the women to think about their own status in society and their own rights. In the U.S., women in various states started getting together to demand their right to common education with men for women's rights to property and divorce. The Seneca Fall Convention, organized by Stanton, Anthony, and others in 1848, proved to be a landmark in the history of the first phase of the women's movement in the U.S. They adopted a Declaration of Sentiments modeled on the Declaration of Independence, in which they demanded equal rights in marriage, property, wages, and the vote. For 20 years after this convention, state-level conventions were held. Propaganda campaigns through lecture tours, pamphlets, and signature petitions were conducted. In 1868, an amendment was brought to the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, granting the right to vote to blacks but not to women. Stanton and Anthony campaigned against this amendment but were unsuccessful in preventing it. A split between the women and abolitionists took place. Meanwhile, the working class movement also grew, though the established trade union leadership was not interested in organizing women workers. Only the IWW supported efforts to organize women workers who worked long hours for extremely low wages. Thousands of women were garment workers. Anarchists, socialists, Marxists, some of whom were women, worked among the workers and organized them. Among them were Emma Goldman, Ella Reeves Bloor, Mother Jones, and Sojourner Truth. In the 1880s, militant struggles and repression became the order of the day. Most of the suffrage leaders showed no interest in the exploitation of workers and did not support their movement. Towards the end of the century and beginning of the 20th century, a working-class women's movement developed rapidly. The high point of this was the strike of almost 40,000 women garment workers in 1909. The socialist women were very active in Europe, and leading communist women like Eleanor Marx, Clara Zetkin, Alexandra Kollontai, Vera Zasulich were in the forefront of the struggle to organize working women. Thousands of working women were organized, and women's papers and magazines were published. It was at the Second International Conference of Working Women in Copenhagen that Clara Zetkin, the German communist and famous leader of the international women's movement, inspired by the struggle of American women workers, moved the resolution to commemorate March 8th as Women's Day at the international level. By the end of the century, the women's situation had undergone much change in the U.S. Though they did not have the right to vote, in the field of education, property rights, employment, they had made gains. Hence the demand for the vote gained respectability. The movement took a more conservative turn, separating the question of gaining the right to vote from all other social and political issues. Their main tactics were petitioning and lobbying with senators. It became active in 1914 with the entry of Alice Paul, who introduced the militant tactics of the British suffragettes, like picketing, hunger strikes, sit-ins, etc. Due to their active campaign and militant tactics, women won the right to vote in America in 1920. The women's struggle in Britain started later than the American movement, but it took a more militant turn in the beginning of the 20th century with Emmeline Pankhurst, her daughters and their supporters adopting militant tactics to draw attention to their demands, facing arrest several times to press their demand. They had formed the Women's Social and Political Union, the WPSU, in 1903 when they got disillusioned with the style of work of the older organizations. This WPSU spearheaded the agitation for suffrage. But they compromised with the British government when the First World War broke out in 1914. Both in the US and in England, the leaders of the movement were white and middle class and restricted their demand to the middle class women. It was the socialist and communist women who rejected the demand for the vote being limited to those with property and broadened the demand to include the vote for all women, including working class women. They organized separate mass mobilizations in support of the demand for the women's right to vote. The women's movement did not continue during the period of the Depression, the rise of fascism, and the World War. In the post-Second World War period, America saw a boom in its economy and the growth of the middle class. In the war years, women had taken up all sorts of jobs to run the economy, but after that, they were encouraged to give up their jobs and become good housewives and mothers. This balloon of prosperity and contentment lasted till the 1960s. Social unrest with the Black civil rights movement gained ground, and later the anti-war movement against the Vietnam War emerged. It was a period of great turmoil. The Cultural Revolution that began in China, too, had its impact. Political activity among university students increased, and it is in this atmosphere of social and political turmoil that the women's movement once again emerged, this time initially from among university students and faculty. Women realized that they faced discrimination in employment, in wages, and overall in the way they were treated in society. The consumerist ideology also came under attack. Simone de Beauvoir had written The Second Sex in 1949 itself, but its impact was felt now. Betty Friedan had written The Feminine Mystique in 1963. The book became extremely popular. She initiated the National Organization of Women in 1966 to fight against the discrimination women faced and to struggle for equal rights amendments. But the autonomous women's movement, radical feminist movement, emerged from within the student movement that had leftist leanings. Black students in the Student Nonviolent Coordination Council, SNCC, which campaigned for civil rights for blacks, threw out the white men and women students at the Chicago Convention in 1968 on the grounds that only blacks would struggle for black liberation. Similarly, the idea that women's liberation is a women's struggle gained ground. In this context, women members of the Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS, demanded that women's liberation be a part of the National Council in their June 1968 convention, but they were hissed and voted down. Many of these women walked out and formed the WRAP, the Women's Radical Action Project, in Chicago. Women within the new University Conference, the NUC, a national-level body of university students, staff, and faculty who wanted a socialist America, formed a women's caucus. Marlene Dixon and Naomi Whiston from Chicago were leading in this. Shulamith Firestone and Pamela Allen began similar activity in New York and formed the New York Radical Women, the NYRW. All of them rejected the liberal view that changes in the law and equal rights amendment would solve women's oppression and believed that the entire structure of society had to be transformed. Hence, they called themselves radical. They came to hold the opinion that mixed groups and parties, men and women, like the Socialist Party, the SDS, and the New Left, would not be able to take the struggle for women's liberation forward, and a women's movement, autonomous from parties, was needed. The NYRW's first public action was the protest against the Miss America Beauty Contest, which brought the fledgling women's movement into national prominence. A year later, the NYWR divided into Red Stockings and WITCH, the Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell. The Red Stockings issued their manifesto in 1969, and in this, the position of radical feminism was clearly presented for the first time. Quote, "We identify the agents of our oppression as men. Male supremacy is the oldest, most basic form of domination. All other forms of exploitation and oppression, racism, capitalism, imperialism, etc., are extensions of male supremacy. Men dominate women, and a few men dominate the rest." Unquote. Sisterhood is powerful and the personal is political became their slogans, which gained wide popularity. Meanwhile, the SDS issued its position paper on women's liberation in December 1968. This was debated by women from various points of view. Kathy McAfee and Myrna Wood wrote Bread and Roses to signify that the struggle cannot be only against economic exploitation of capitalism, bread, but also against the psychological and social oppression that women faced, roses. These debates carried out in the various journals produced by the women's groups that emerged in this period were taken seriously and influenced the course and trends within the women's movement not only in the US, but in other countries as well. The groups mainly took the form of small circles for consciousness raising. It must be noted that all of these were following either the Trotskyite or Cuban socialism within the left movement. They opposed all types of hierarchical structures. In this way, the socialist feminist and the radical feminist trend within the women's movement emerged. Though it had many limitations if seen from a Marxist perspective, it raised questions and brought many aspects of women oppression out into the open. In the later 1960s and early 70s in the US and Western Europe, quote, different groups had different visions of revolution. There were feminist, black, anarchist, Marxist-Leninist, and other versions of revolutionary politics, but the belief that revolution of one sort or another was round the corner cut across these divisions, unquote. Barbara Epstein. The socialist, Marxist, and radical feminists shared a vision about revolution. During this first period, the feminists were grappling with Marxist theory and key concepts like production, reproduction, class consciousness, and labor. Both the socialist feminists and the radical feminists were trying to change Marxist theory to incorporate feminist understanding of women's position. But after 1975, there was a shift. Systemic analysis of capitalism of the entire social structure was replaced or recast as cultural feminism. Cultural feminism begins with the assumption that men and women are basically different. It focused on the cultural features of patriarchal oppression and primarily aimed for reforms in this area. Unlike radical and socialist feminism, it adamantly rejects any critique of capitalism and emphasizes patriarchy as the roots of women's oppression and veers towards separatism. In the late 1970s and 1980s, lesbian feminism emerged as one current within the feminist movement. At the same time, women of color, black women, third world women in the advanced capitalist countries raised criticisms about the ongoing feminist movement and began to articulate their versions of feminism. Organizations among working class women for equal treatment at the workplace, childcare, etc. also started growing. That the feminist movement had been restricted to white, middle-class, educated women in advanced capitalist countries and was focusing on issues primarily of their concern had become obvious. This gave rise to global, or multicultural feminism. In the third world countries, women's groups also became active, but all the issues were not necessarily purely women's issues. Violence against women has been a major issue, especially rape, but alongside there have been issues that emerged from exploitation due to colonialism and neocolonialism, poverty and exploitation by landlords, peasant issues, displacement, apartheid, and many other such problems that were important in their own countries. In the early 1990s, postmodernism became influential among feminists. But the right-wing conservative backlash against feminism grew in the 1980s, focusing opposition to the feminist struggle for abortion rights. They also attacked feminism for destroying the family, emphasizing the importance of women's role in the family. Yet the feminist perspective spread wide and countless activist groups, social and cultural projects at the grassroots grew and continued to be active. Women's studies too spread widely. Healthcare and environment issues have been the focus of attention with many of these groups. Many leading feminists were absorbed in academic jobs. At the same time, many of these major organizations and caucuses have become large institutions, absorbed by the establishment, run with staff, and like any established bureaucratic institution. Activism declined. In the 1990s, the feminist movement is known more from the activities of these organizations and the writings of feminists in the academic realm. Quote, feminism has become more an idea than a movement, and one that lacks the visionary quality it once had, unquote, wrote Barbara Epstein in the Monthly Review, May 2001. In the 1990s, the increasing gap between the economic condition of working class and oppressed minorities and the middle classes, the continuing gender inequality, increasing violence on women, the onslaught of globalization and its impact on people, especially women in the third world, has led to a renewed interest in Marxism. At the same time, the participation of women, especially young women, in a range of political movements, as evident in the anti-globalization and anti-war movements, has further helped the process of awakening. With this brief overview of the development of the women's movement in the West, we will analyze the propositions of the main theoretical trends within the feminist movement.